Imagine standing at the foot of a massive stone fortress, its walls scarred by the marks of countless battles, its towers casting long shadows over the land. This isn't just a castle, it's a witness to one of history's most epic conflicts, the 100 Years' War. For over a century, these towering strongholds became the stage for sieges that would decide the fate of nations, the backdrop for stories of bravery, betrayal, and sheer human determination. Today, we're stepping into the past to uncover the gripping tales of 25 castles that stood at the heart of this brutal war, each one a testament to the ingenuity and resilience of those who built, defended, and sometimes lost them. Think about what it meant to lay siege to a castle in the 14th or 15th century. It wasn't just about breaking down walls, it was a battle of wits, endurance, and sheer willpower. Attackers would surround these fortresses for months, even years, cutting off supplies, tunneling beneath the foundations, or launching trebuchets to rain destruction from afar. Inside, defenders would endure hunger, disease, and constant fear, all while clinging to the hope of relief or a miracle. These weren't just military engagements. They were human dramas where the stakes were life and death, and the outcomes shaped the course of history. From the rugged coastlines of Normandy to the rolling hills of Aquitaine, each castle we'll explore has a unique story to tell. Some fell quickly, their defenses no match for the relentless assault. Others held out against impossible odds, becoming legends of resistance. And then there are those that changed hands multiple times, their walls echoing with the footsteps of both victors and vanquished. But why do these sieges still matter today? Because they remind us that history isn't just about dates and battles, it's about people. The knights who fought for honor, the peasants who sought shelter behind these walls, the commanders who made split-second decisions that altered the course of the war. By the time we're done, you'll see these castles not just as ruins or tourist attractions, but as living chapters in a story that still resonates centuries later. So let's begin our journey through time, through conflict, and through the enduring legacy of these incredible fortresses. To truly grasp why castles became such pivotal battlegrounds during the 100 Years' War, we need to step back and see the bigger picture. This wasn't just a war, it was a collision of dynasties, a struggle over who had the rightful claim to the French crown. The conflict began in 1337 when England's King Edward III, grandson of Francis Philip IV, declared himself the true heir to the French throne. What followed was over a century of intermittent warfare, where borders blurred and loyalties shifted like the tides. At its core, this was a war about power and identity. The English held vast territories in France, particularly in regions like Gascony and Aquitaine, creating a tangled web of feudal obligations. French kings resented this foreign presence on their soil, while English monarchs saw these lands as their birthright. But beyond the royal squabbles, the war reshaped how battles were fought. Armies no longer just clashed on open fields. They targeted strongholds, knowing that capturing a castle meant controlling the surrounding countryside, its resources, and its people. Siege warfare became an art form during this period. Attackers employed everything from starvation tactics to early gunpowder weapons, while defenders perfected countermeasures like reinforced gatehouses and concentric walls. The introduction of cannons in the later stages of the war marked a turning point, as stone walls that had stood for centuries could now be shattered in days. Yet, even as technology evolved, the human element remained constant: the desperation of a garrison running low on food, the cunning of a commander exploiting a weakness in the enemy's lines, or the sheer stubbornness of a town refusing to yield. This was also a war that blurred the lines between soldier and civilian. Peasants often found themselves caught in the crossfire, seeking refuge within castle walls only to endure the horrors of prolonged sieges. Meanwhile, the conflict fueled innovations in governance and military logistics, as both sides struggled to fund their campaigns and keep armies supplied across vast distances. By the time the war ended in 1453, it had redrawn the map of Europe and left behind a legacy of fortified ruins, each one a silent witness to the ambitions, triumphs, and tragedies of a turbulent age. Picture a chessboard where castles aren't just pieces, they're the entire game. In medieval warfare, these stone giants weren't merely noble residences, they were the ultimate power plays carved into the landscape. Perched on cliffs coiled around river bends or looming over crossroads, their locations were never accidental. A well-placed castle could choke enemy supply lines, shelter friendly troops, or project royal authority over miles of countryside with just the threat of its archers and boiling oil. The 100 Years' War turned these fortresses into the era's most coveted prizes. Why waste energy chasing mobile armies when capturing a castle meant controlling the land itself? Sieges became grueling contests of stamina and innovation. Attackers might spend months constructing wooden siege towers or digging tunnels to undermine walls, only for defenders to counter by digging their own tunnels to collapse the enemies. Moats weren't just decorative, they forced attackers to wade through water while dodging arrows. Arrow slits, barely wider than a hand's breadth, let defenders shoot out safely while offering almost no target in return. Yet castles were never invincible. The war's shifting tide saw many change hands repeatedly, their walls bearing silent witness to ingenious betrayals. A bribe could open a postern gate under cover of night. Trebuchets hulking siege engines capable of hurling 300-pound stones could reduce towers to rubble in days. And as the war dragged on, the thunder of early cannons announced a chilling truth. No wall was thick enough to withstand the coming age of gunpowder. What's fascinating is how these structures adapted. After witnessing the devastation of early bombardments, engineers designed squat, rounded towers to deflect cannonballs. Concentric rings of walls created kill zones where attackers, having breached one barrier, found themselves trapped under a hail of crossbow bolts from the next. Even castle kitchens played their part. Massive fireplaces could heat sand or oil to pour through murder holes above besiegers. Every architectural detail tells of a desperate arms race between those who built fortresses and those determined to tear them down. Beyond their military function, castles were psychological weapons. The sight of their silhouettes on the horizon could deter rebellion or inspire loyalty. For peasants, they offered refuge during raids, though overcrowded conditions often led to disease outbreaks deadlier than any sword. And when a castle finally fell, its capture wasn't just a tactical victory but a blow to enemy morale, proof that even the mightiest strongholds could bow to relentless pressure. As we explore specific castles in our list, you'll notice how their fates mirrored the war's broader narrative. Some, like Château Gaillard, fell due to overlooked weaknesses. In its case, an unguarded latrine chute became the invader's secret passage. Others, like the virtually impregnable Mont-Saint-Michel, endured every assault through a combination of geography and grit. Each siege was a microcosm of the conflict, a test of resources, leadership, and sheer human tenacity that shaped the borders of modern Europe. Château Gaillard wasn't just a castle, it was Richard the Lionheart's defiant answer to anyone who doubted English dominance in Normandy. Built in just 2 years between 1196 and 1198, this fortress soared above the Seine like a stone crown, its concentric walls and razor-sharp angles daring attackers to even try. Richard famously boasted he could hold it even if its walls were made of butter, a claim that would be put to the grimmest test less than a decade after his death. What made Galard so revolutionary was its design. Unlike older castles with single curtain walls, Richard's engineers created three-layered defenses, each higher than the last, forcing attackers to fight through deadly choke points. The outer bailey's crescent-shaped wall deflected siege engines, while the middle ward's steep slopes made scaling ladders nearly impossible. Then came the inner sanctum, a donut-shaped keep with walls 10 feet thick, where defenders could rain death from all sides. It was medieval warfare's equivalent of a Russian nesting doll. Every layer breached only meant walking into another death trap. Yet in 1204, French King Philip Augustus proved even brilliance has blind spots. His 6-month siege ground down the garrison through sheer attrition, but the final blow came from an oversight that still makes historians wince. During a winter assault, French soldiers noticed the castle's garderobes. Those stone toilet chutes jutting from the walls were wide enough to squeeze through. While English crossbowmen focused on repelling ladders at the main walls, a daring team waded through frozen sewage, emerging inside the chapel's latrine to open the gates from within. The lesson was brutal. No fortress, no matter how advanced, could compensate for human oversight. The fall of Galard sent shockwaves through Europe. For the English, it wasn't just the loss of a stronghold. It was the collapse of their entire Norman frontier. Within months, key towns like Rouen and Keene surrendered without resistance, their garrisons demoralized by Galard's fate. The French, meanwhile, gained not just territory but something priceless, proof that patience and ingenuity could overcome even the era's finest military architecture. What lingers most about Galard's story isn't its engineering marvels or its humiliating downfall, but what it reveals about medieval warfare's evolving nature. This was the moment castles stopped being untouchable symbols of power and became chess pieces in a larger game where logistics, psychology, and sheer endurance mattered as much as towering walls. As we walk its crumbling ramparts today, we're not just seeing ruins, we're standing where history pivoted, where one overlooked detail rewrote the rules of conquest. If Château Gaillard was the fortress that couldn't hold, Calais was the prize England refused to let go. This wasn't just another coastal town, it was the linchpin of English ambitions, a gateway between the continent and the British Isles. When Edward III laid siege in 1346, he wasn't just after territory. He wanted a permanent foothold, a place where English armies could land, resupply, and project power deep into French lands. The siege that followed would become legendary, not just for its brutality, but for the extraordinary sacrifice that defined its end. For 11 grueling months, the people of Calais endured the unthinkable. Edward's forces encircled the town, cutting off all supply lines by land and sea. Food ran out so completely that chronicles tell of residents eating rats and boiling leather for broth. Yet the garrison held on, hoping for relief from French King Philip VI. That relief never came. By August 1347, with starvation claiming lives daily, the town's leaders made the agonizing decision to surrender. But Edward, furious at the prolonged resistance, demanded a chilling price. 6 of Calais' leading citizens were to present themselves with ropes around their necks, ready to die for their city's defiance. What happened next became one of the war's most enduring stories. 6 burghers, wealthy merchants who'd lost everything in the siege, stepped forward voluntarily. Barefoot and dressed in sackcloth, they carried the town's keys to Edward, offering their lives to spare their fellow citizens. It was a moment of raw humanity that transcended the war's politics. so powerful that even Edward's queen, Philippa, intervened, pleading for their pardon. The king relented, but his terms were clear. Calais would now be English, its French population expelled and replaced with loyal subjects from across the Channel. The strategic impact of this victory can't be overstated. For over 2 centuries, Calais functioned as England's continental bridgehead, a bustling port where wool, arms, and soldiers flowed in both directions. Its loss in 1558 was mourned in England as a national tragedy. Queen Mary I allegedly said the word Calais would be found engraved on her heart after her death. But during the 100 Years' War, it was the ultimate bargaining chip, a constant threat that forced French kings to divert resources from other fronts. What makes Calais' story so compelling isn't just the military calculus, but the way it encapsulates the war's human cost. The burgher's sacrifice, immortalized in Rodin's famous sculpture, reminds us that behind every siege were real people, faces we might recognize in our own neighbors today. Their willingness to die for their community speaks to something deeper than medieval notions of honor. It's a universal story of courage in the face of impossible choices. And for the English, Calais became more than a possession. It was a symbol of their continental identity, a tangible connection to lands they believed were rightfully theirs. When that connection was finally severed, it marked the end of an era, closing a chapter that began with Edward's cannons echoing over starving streets. Harfleur wasn't just another coastal town, it was the key that would unlock Henry V's audacious plan to reclaim France. When his army landed in August 1415, the sight of its massive walls and water-filled moats must have sent a chill through even the most seasoned English soldiers. This wasn't some crumbling fortress. Harfleur boasted state-of-the-art defenses, with 30-foot-thick walls reinforced by 26 towers and a moat fed by the nearby Seine. Yet Henry had come prepared with a weapon that would change siege warfare forever: cannons. The bombardment began immediately, with the English positioning their guns at point-blank range, close enough that the gunners could see the fear in defenders' eyes. For weeks, the thunder of artillery shook the countryside as stone balls weighing over 400 pounds slammed into Harfleur's walls. But technology alone couldn't win this siege. As summer heat intensified, so did the suffering. The surrounding marshes bred disease, and dysentery, known then as the Bloody Flux, ravaged both armies. Soldiers collapsed from dehydration. Knights died not in glory but in their own filth. At one point, Henry lost more men to illness in a single week than he would later lose at Agincourt. What makes Harfleur's fall so significant isn't just the military victory, but the ruthless calculus that followed. When the town finally surrendered on September 22nd, Henry faced a dilemma. His army was decimated by disease, and holding Harfleur required garrisoning precious troops he couldn't spare. His solution: expel the entire French population, replacing them with English settlers, a chilling preview of modern ethnic cleansing. The message was clear: this wasn't temporary occupation but permanent conquest. Strategically, Harfleur became the anchor for England's campaigns in France. But its capture also forced Henry into the march that led to Agincourt. With his army weakened, he chose to move toward Calais rather than attack Paris, a decision that would culminate in one of history's most improbable victories. The siege legacy is a paradox. It showcased both medieval warfare's gruesome realities and the emerging power of gunpowder. Those shattered walls weren't just a tactical achievement, they were the sound of a new era arriving, one where castles would never be the same. Walking through Harfleur today, you can still trace the scars of 1415 in the uneven stonework where cannonballs struck. But the deeper wound is invisible, the memory of a vibrant port forever altered by 5 weeks of terror. a town that became collateral damage in a king's quest for glory. It reminds us that behind every siege statistic were mothers hiding children in cellars, merchants watching lifetimes of work go up in flames, and the silent majority who paid the price for decisions made in distant courts. Rouen wasn't just a city, it was the beating heart of Normandy, a thriving center of trade and culture with walls that had repelled invaders for centuries. But by the winter of 1418, those walls became a prison for its own people. When Henry V's army encircled the city in July, the stage was set for one of the most harrowing sieges of the 100 Years' War. This wasn't merely a military blockade, it was a calculated campaign of starvation, a test of how much suffering a population could endure before breaking. Inside Rouen, desperation mounted as food stores dwindled. By autumn, the streets echoed with the cries of children whose parents could no longer feed them. Chroniclers recount how citizens slaughtered their horses for meat, then turned to dogs, cats, and finally rats, but the most chilling decision came from the city's leaders. Facing impossible choices, they made the unthinkable calculation, expelling over 12,000 of the poorest and weakest from the gates. These starved souls, mostly women, children, and elderly, stumbled toward the English lines, pleading for mercy. Henry's response was ruthless. His soldiers forced them back into the no-man's land between the armies, where they perished slowly in the frozen ditches, their agonized wails carrying back to the city walls. The siege's psychological toll reshaped medieval warfare. Henry understood that breaking a city's spirit could be as decisive as breaching its walls. By allowing the expelled to die within sight of their families, he turned despair into a weapon. When Rouen finally surrendered in January 1419, it wasn't just hunger that had defeated its defenders. It was the crushing realization that no relief was coming, that their king had abandoned them to their fate. Rouen's fall sent shockwaves across Europe. As Normandy's capital, its capture meant the entire region now answered to England. Henry installed a garrison and transformed the city into a hub for English administration, but the scars ran deep. For generations, mothers would whisper of the winter the Seine ran red not with water, but with the consequences of ambition. The siege legacy wasn't just territorial, it revealed the darkest truths about medieval conflict, where civilians became pawns and resilience had limits. Today, walking Rouen's rebuilt streets, you're treading on layers of memory, where 6 months of hunger left wounds no stone could ever fully conceal. Orléans wasn't just a city under siege, it was the last thread holding France together. By October 1428, English forces had tightened their grip, surrounding its walls with a ring of fortified strongholds they called bastilles. The situation seemed hopeless. France's king, Charles VII, was paralyzed by indecision, his court fractured by infighting, and his treasury empty. Then, in a twist that still feels miraculous, a 17-year-old peasant girl from Domremy arrived with an audacious claim. God had sent her to save France. Joan of Arc's presence electrified the demoralized defenders, turning a military stalemate into a legend. What made Orléans so critical wasn't just its location on the Loire River, it was the psychological line in the sand. If it fell, all of southern France would lie open to English conquest. The siege had dragged on for 6 months, with the English choking off supply routes and bombarding the city daily. But Joan's arrival in April 1429 shattered the status quo. Clad in white armor and carrying a banner painted with fleurs de lis, she didn't just inspire the troops, she rewrote the playbook. Where French commanders had hesitated, she attacked. When seasoned knights advised caution, she led cavalry charges against entrenched positions. Her most daring move came at the fortress of Les Tourelles, where she rallied soldiers to storm a heavily defended bastion despite being wounded by an arrow. By May 8th, the English were in retreat, their siege broken. The victory's impact rippled far beyond the battlefield. For the English, it was a devastating blow to their aura of invincibility. For the French, it proved divine favor could tip the scales, or at least that belief could. Joan's insistence on swift, aggressive action exposed a flaw in medieval siege warfare. Defenders often expected prolonged blockades, not relentless assaults. Her tactics also highlighted the power of morale. Soldiers who'd once fought for pay now fought for something transcendent, convinced heaven marched alongside them. Yet Orléans' legacy is bittersweet. Though it marked the war's turning point, Joan herself would be captured within a year, burned as a heretic by the English. The city she saved became a pilgrimage site, its liberation celebrated annually as the Fête de Jeanne d'Arc. Walking its streets today, you can still see the rebuilt gates where she entered, the plaques marking where cannonballs struck. But what lingers isn't just the history. It's the echo of that improbable moment when a teenager's conviction proved mightier than walls, when faith moved an army and a siege became the stuff of miracles. Keene stood as a living monument to Norman might, its massive castle built by William the Conqueror himself in 1060, looming over the city like a stone sentinel. By 1346, this jewel of Normandy had known centuries of relative peace, its thick walls more symbolic than battle-tested. But when Edward III's army appeared that July, Keene's residents learned a brutal truth. No amount of history could shield them from the 100 Years' War's fury. The English assault was swift and merciless, while the castle's keeper, a squat, formidable tower, proved too strong to storm directly. The town's outer defenses crumbled under a hail of arrows and siege engines. What happened next wasn't just a military defeat, but a calculated lesson in terror. Edward's troops sacked Keene with deliberate cruelty, burning homes, slaughtering civilians, and looting so thoroughly that chroniclers wrote of wagons groaning under the weight of stolen treasure. The message was unmistakable. Resistance would be met with utter devastation. Yet amid the carnage, an unexpected twist emerged. The castle's garrison, holed up in William's ancient keep, refused to surrender even as their city burned around them. For days, these holdouts watched smoke rise from the ruins while English sappers tried in vain to undermine the keep's 11-foot thick walls. Their stubborn defense highlighted a critical reality of medieval warfare. Castles weren't standalone fortresses but anchors in a broader defensive web. Though Keene's urban perimeter had fallen, the castle remained a thorn in Edward's side, forcing him to leave a sizable force behind as his army marched toward the fateful Battle of Crécy. The siege's aftermath reveals much about the war's shifting dynamics. Edward didn't just take Keene, he systematically dismantled its ability to resist. By destroying the town but preserving the castle, which later became an English administrative hub, he demonstrated a new approach to conquest, one that blended brutality with pragmatism. For the French, Keene's fall was a wake-up call. Their reliance on aging Norman fortifications, designed for 11th century warfare, left them dangerously exposed to 14th century siege tactics. Walking through Keene today, you can still trace the layers of this story. The castle's keep stands remarkably intact, its weathered stones whispering of William's ambitions and Edward's reckoning. But look closer, and you'll find subtler scars, the uneven spacing of medieval houses in rebuilt neighborhoods, evidence of streets that never fully recovered from that summer of fire. Keene's tale isn't just about walls breached or treasures lost. It's a reminder that in total war, even the mightiest symbols of power become chess pieces, and sometimes the greatest casualties are the ordinary lives caught between kings. Bordeaux wasn't just another city, it was the crown jewel of English Aquitaine, a place where Gascon wine flowed as freely as the gold it brought into royal coffers. For over 300 years, this bustling port had been the beating heart of England's continental empire, its loyalty secured not by force but by mutual interest. The Gascons had grown rich under English rule, trading their world-renowned claret across Europe, and in return, they'd built formidable defenses like the Château Gaillard, a fortress guarding the city's western approach. But by the mid-15th century, the tides of war were turning, and Bordeaux found itself the last domino standing in a collapsing English dominion. The French siege of 1453 wasn't sudden. It was the culmination of decades of pressure. King Charles VII had spent years methodically dismantling English strongholds across Aquitaine, learning from past mistakes. Unlike earlier campaigns that relied on brute force, this time the French combined military might with shrewd diplomacy. They cut off Bordeaux's trade routes, strangling the economic lifeline that had kept the city loyal to England. Meanwhile, they offered generous terms to surrounding towns, convincing them to switch allegiances without a fight. By the time French armies arrived at Bordeaux's gates, the city was isolated, its once powerful network of allies reduced to whispers. What makes this siege so poignant is how it underscores the war's changing nature. The Château Gaillard, designed to repel medieval assaults, now faced the full might of modern artillery. French cannons, more advanced than those used at Harfleur decades earlier, pounded its walls relentlessly. Yet the real battle wasn't just over stone and mortar, it was for the hearts of Bordeaux's citizens. Many Gascons, though long allied with England, began questioning whether continued resistance was worth the ruin. When the city finally surrendered on October 19, 1453, it wasn't just a military defeat but a cultural reckoning. The aftermath was surprisingly merciful. Charles allowed the English garrison to depart unharmed and even let Bordeaux keep some trading privileges, but the symbolic weight was crushing. After centuries of presence, England's continental ambitions had evaporated almost overnight. The war didn't officially end with a treaty. It simply stopped like a clock whose gears had finally worn out. Bordeaux's fall marked more than a political shift. It was the closing of an era where kings could claim foreign thrones through dynastic technicalities. Walking through modern Bordeaux, you can still trace echoes of this pivotal moment. The Château Gaillard is long gone, replaced by later fortifications, but the city's medieval quays still bear the grooves where English ships once loaded barrels of wine. It's a reminder that history's greatest conflicts aren't always decided on battlefields, but in the quiet erosion of loyalty, the slow realization that the world has moved on. Bordeaux's story isn't just about walls breached or banners lowered. It's about how trade, time, and weary hearts can accomplish what armies alone cannot. Cherbourg's castle wasn't just strong, it was a masterpiece of medieval engineering, a labyrinth of walls within walls that seemed to mock the very idea of conquest. Perched on a rocky outcrop overlooking the English Channel, its defenses were so formidable that many believed it could withstand any siege indefinitely. The English had poured vast resources into reinforcing it, turning Cherbourg into the anchor of their Norman holdings. But in 1450, this supposed invincibility met its match in the form of French artillery and sheer strategic brilliance. The French commander, Jean Bureau, understood that traditional assault tactics would be suicide against Cherbourg's concentric defenses. Instead, he orchestrated a methodical bombardment, positioning his cannons on elevated ground to rain destruction down upon the castle's inner sanctum. These weren't the crude, unreliable guns of earlier decades. They were precision instruments of war, capable of hurling stone shot with devastating accuracy. Day after day, the thunder of artillery echoed across the countryside, each impact sending shockwaves through the castle's foundations. Walls that had stood for centuries began to crumble like sandcastles at high tide. What truly doomed Cherbourg, though, wasn't just the cannons. It was the French mastery of siegecraft. Bureau's sappers dug tunnels beneath the castle's outer defenses, collapsing entire sections of wall in coordinated explosions. Meanwhile, his troops constructed movable barricades to shield their advance, inching closer with each passing week. Inside the castle, the English garrison watched in horror as their once proud stronghold was systematically dismantled around them. By July, with food running low and no hope of relief, they had no choice but to surrender. The fall of Cherbourg sent shockwaves through both sides. For the English, it was the final nail in the coffin of their Norman ambitions. Within months, every last foothold in the region would be lost. For the French, it was proof that no fortress, no matter how well designed, could resist the new realities of gunpowder warfare. Cherbourg's surrender didn't just mark the end of a siege, it marked the end of an era. The age of castles as untouchable strongholds was over, replaced by a world where firepower and logistics could topple even the mightiest walls. Walking through Cherbourg's ruins today, you can still see the jagged scars left by Bureau's cannons, silent witnesses to the moment medieval warfare changed forever. But the real lesson of Cherbourg isn't written in stone. It's in the chilling realization that no defense is truly impregnable. What took generations to build could be undone in months, a reminder that in war, as in life, the only constant is change. Saint-Sovola Vicomte stood as a monument to the 100 Years' War's most uncomfortable truth that loyalty was often just the highest bidder's privilege. Unlike castles that fell to overwhelming force or brilliant strategy, this Norman stronghold became infamous for its revolving door of allegiances, changing hands not through heroic assaults but whispered deals and midnight betrayals. Its story exposes the war's underbelly, where mercenary captains played both sides like chess masters, and survival routinely trumped oaths of fealty. The castle's most shocking moment came in 1375, when its entire English garrison men paid to defend the crown's interests abruptly opened the gates to French forces. This wasn't some desperate last stand, it was a cold business decision. Many of these English soldiers were actually Gascon mercenaries, professional fighters who cared more about steady pay than national pride. When French commanders offered better wages and promises of plunder, the garrison's commanders calculated that switching sides beat starving through another winter in a war with no end in sight. What makes Saint-Sovola Vicomte so fascinating is how its betrayals mirror the war's broader instability. Castles weren't just military assets, they were economic engines for the regions around them. Controlling one meant collecting taxes, demanding supplies, and taking a cut of local trade. For garrison captains, holding a fortress was essentially running a small business, and like any business, sometimes you had to pivot to stay solvent. The French understood this better than the English, frequently offering defectors not just gold but noble titles and land grants. Yet the castle's turbulent history also reveals a darker reality, the human cost of this mercenary culture. Peasants living near Saint-Sovola Vicomte never knew if today's liberators would become tomorrow's oppressors. Chroniclers tell of villages pillaged by the same soldiers who'd sworn to protect them weeks earlier, their loyalty flipping with each new contract. The castle's walls, pockmarked by countless sieges, became a physical record of how often promises were broken. By the war's end, Saint-Sovola Vicomte had changed flags so many times that locals joked its stones were stained not with blood but with indecision. That cynical humor masks a deeper truth. This castle story forces us to question romanticized notions of medieval warfare. There were no clear heroes or villains here, just pragmatic men making brutal choices in a conflict that outlasted generations. Walking its ruins today, you're not standing in a monument to valor, but to the uncomfortable calculus of survival, where honor often bowed to hunger and cold, hard coin. Meaux wasn't just another siege, it was Henry V's final gamble, a grueling test of endurance that would ultimately cost him far more than he gained. When the English king marched his army to this fortified town in October 1421, he expected another quick victory like Harfleur. Instead, he found himself bogged down in one of the most brutal standoffs of the entire war, facing defenders who would rather starve than surrender. The town's position on the Marne River made it a critical supply hub for Paris, its thick walls reinforced by a deep moat and 30 towers, a challenge that would push Henry's famed military genius to its limits. For 8 agonizing months, the siege became a war of attrition. As winter set in, conditions inside Meaux grew desperate. Chroniclers recount how defenders slaughtered their horses for food, then turned to boiling leather and eating rats. Outside the walls, Henry's camp fared little better. The marshy riverbanks bred disease, and the king himself fell victim to dysentery, the same bloody flux that had ravaged his troops at Harfleur. Yet, unlike that earlier siege, there would be no triumphant march to Agincourt afterward. The sickness clung to Henry like a shadow, weakening him even as Meaux's gates finally creaked open in May 1422. What makes this siege so revealing is how it exposes the personal dangers medieval rulers faced on campaign. Modern leaders wage war from secure bunkers or video screens, but Henry led from the muddy trenches, sharing every hardship with his men. When dysentery struck, there were no royal physicians capable of saving him, just the same crude treatments given to common soldiers. His eventual death in August 1422, just months after Meaux's fall, wasn't some distant tragedy. It was the direct consequence of those freezing nights by the Marne, where a king's body proved as vulnerable as any peasant's. Meaux's legacy extends beyond Henry's fate. The siege marked a turning point in English fortunes the moment their momentum began to falter. While the victory secured their hold on the Paris region temporarily, it came at too high a price. Without Henry's leadership, the English war effort lost its driving force, gradually unraveling over the next decades. The town itself became a cautionary tale about the limits of medieval siegecraft, proving that even the strongest defenses couldn't outlast starvation, and that sometimes the greatest threats to conquerors weren't enemy swords but the invisible killers lurking in camp latrines. Walking Meaux's quiet streets today, you'd hardly guess this was once the stage for such suffering. The rebuilt walls show no trace of Henry's bombardment, the riverbanks no hint of the disease-ridden camps. But the deeper lesson remains. In an age when kings led from the front, victory could be as dangerous as defeat, and the cost of conquest wasn't measured just in gold or land, but in the very lives of those bold enough to wage it. Mont-Saint-Michel wasn't just a fortress, it was a divine defiance, a towering abbey rising from the sea like a middle finger to English ambition. Perched on a rocky island off Normandy's coast, this sacred stronghold had more in common with a mirage than a military target. Its walls seemed to shift with the tides, one moment accessible by a thin causeway, the next encircled by churning waters that drowned would-be attackers. When English forces tried to lay siege in 1423, they weren't just battling monks and militias, they were fighting the ocean itself. What made Mont-Saint-Michel untouchable wasn't just its natural moat, but the perfect harmony of faith and fortification. Benedictine monks had spent centuries transforming this granite outcrop into a layered masterpiece. with spiral staircases designed to favor right-handed defenders and terrace defenses that forced attackers uphill into killing zones. The abbey's storehouses could hold years of provisions, its deep cisterns never ran dry, and its position allowed lookouts to spot enemy movements hours before they reached the gates. But the real secret weapon, the tides, twice daily the sea surged in with terrifying speed, cutting off retreat and drowning unprepared besiegers. English chronicles tell of entire supply wagons swallowed by the waves, their drowned oxen still hitched to carts when the waters receded. The psychological impact of this unconquerable sanctuary rippled far beyond its walls. While Normandy's towns fell one by one to English conquest, Mont-Saint-Michel became a beacon of French resistance, a place where refugees fled, where hope endured. Its monks turned the siege into a spiritual spectacle, chanting psalms from the ramparts as arrows clattered harmlessly against stone. For commoners living under English rule, the distant silhouette of the abbey, defiant against the horizon, was a daily reminder that France's soul remained unbroken. Yet the most fascinating twist in this saga isn't the failures of English besiegers, but their reluctant respect. Even as they bombarded the abbey with primitive cannons, many soldiers whispered that the place was protected by Saint Michael himself. The tides didn't just hinder attacks, they created eerie patterns of erosion around the island, shaping sandbanks that seemed to rearrange themselves overnight to foil invasion plans. After 3 failed sieges spanning decades, the English eventually gave up, opting instead to quarantine the island with occasional patrols rather than waste more lives on an impossible conquest. Walking Mont-Saint-Michel's narrow streets today, you can still feel the genius of its design, the way staircases twist to disadvantage invaders, how every courtyard funnels attackers into exposed positions. But the true marvel isn't in the architecture. It's in the stubborn alchemy of geography and belief that made this place more than stone and mortar. In an age when castles fell to treachery or starvation, Mont-Saint-Michel stood as living proof that some strongholds draw their power not just from walls, but from the very elements and the unshakable conviction of those who call them home. Chinon's castle wasn't just a fortress, it was a sanctuary where the fate of France hung in the balance. Perched high above the Vienne River, its sprawling complex of towers and ramparts offered more than physical protection. It became the last refuge of a crown teetering on collapse. By 1429, the Dauphin Charles, heir to a fractured kingdom, had retreated here as English forces tightened their grip on northern France. His court was divided, his treasury empty, and his claim to the throne disputed even by his own mother. Then, in March of that year, an unassuming girl from Domremy arrived at Chinon's gates demanding an audience. Joan of Arc's meeting with the Dauphin in the castle's torch-lit Great Hall would become one of history's most extraordinary turning points. What made Chinon so critical wasn't just its imposing walls, though those were formidable enough, but its symbolic weight. Unlike the stark military strongholds of Normandy, Chinon was a royal residence, its chambers adorned with tapestries and its courtyards designed for ceremony. When Joan knelt before Charles in that storied encounter, she wasn't just addressing a king, she was restoring his belief in his own legitimacy. The castle's very architecture played a role in this drama. Charles, wary of impostors, initially hid among his courtiers, but Joan reportedly identified him instantly, a moment later embellished by legend as divine intervention. Whether through heavenly guidance or shrewd observation, her act pierced the gloom of doubt that had settled over the court. The castle's design reveals why it endured as a royal redoubt. 3 separate fortresses, Fort du Coudray, Fort St. George's, and the Château du Milieu formed a nested defense system, allowing the Dauphin's government to function even under threat. Deep wells ensured water during sieges, while underground passages offered escape routes if the walls were breached. But Chinon's true strength lay in its location, straddling the border between English-held territory and the shrinking French heartland. From here, Charles could rally loyalists, negotiate with wavering nobles, and, with Joan's arrival, launch the campaign that would culminate in the liberation of Orléans. The siege that never came to Chinon speaks volumes about its reputation. English commanders, aware of its daunting defenses and the treacherous river crossings required to reach it, focused instead on easier targets. This allowed the castle to become a nerve center for French resistance, where diplomacy and espionage flourished alongside military planning. Spies slipped in and out with coded messages, bankers secured loans to fund armies, and foreign ambassadors weighed Charles's chances over feasts in the grand halls. In an age when most castles defined themselves through battles, Chinon made its mark by hosting the war's quiet victories, the alliances forged over parchment rather than the clash of steel. Walking through Chinon today, you can still stand in the exact room where Joan and Charles met, where the course of a nation pivoted on a single conversation. The castle's weathered stones don't just tell of sieges averted or armies marshaled. They whisper of something far rarer in wartime hope rekindled. While other fortresses symbolize brute strength, Chinon endures as a testament to the power of persuasion. The moment a disgraced king and an illiterate peasant girl together rewrote history. Its legacy isn't measured in battles won, but in the fragile, human decisions that sometimes alter destiny itself. Saint-Gilles and Calais wasn't just another fortress, it was a test of human endurance pushed to unimaginable limits. When French forces laid siege in 1351, they expected a quick surrender. What they got instead was a masterclass in desperation and defiance. The castle's defenders, a mix of local militia and a handful of hardened knights, had one advantage: thick walls that had stood for generations, but walls alone couldn't fill empty stomachs. As weeks stretched into months, the siege became a slow, grinding nightmare where hunger proved as deadly as any sword. Inside the castle, rations vanished first. Then came the horses, not just the war horses, but every last draft animal and pack mule. When those were gone, dogs and cats followed, then rats, then the leather straps from shields and armor, boiled for hours into barely edible gruel. Finally, as winter deepened, the defenders turned to candle wax mixed with crushed bone, a revolting paste that at least tricked the body into thinking it had eaten. Chroniclers of the siege wrote of soldiers gnawing on their own belts, of mothers offering their children handfuls of straw to chew, yet still the garrison refused to yield. What makes this siege so haunting isn't just the suffering, it's the psychology behind the resistance. These weren't fanatics or professional soldiers bound by oath. Many were farmers and craftsmen who'd never held a sword before the war reached their homes. Their determination sprang from something deeper than loyalty to a distant king, the fear of what would happen if the French broke through. Stories of sacked towns and massacred civilians had reached them long before the siege began. Better to die slowly behind their own walls, they reasoned, than quickly at the enemy's mercy. The French commander, the Duke of Bourbon, grew increasingly frustrated as the siege dragged on. His army, camped in the muddy fields outside the castle, faced its own hardships, disease, desertions, and the mounting cost of maintaining thousands of idle troops. Each day the castle held out was a blow to his reputation. In the end, Saint-Gilles and Calais didn't fall to a heroic assault or cunning stratagem. It fell to simple arithmetic. By February 1352, there were barely enough defenders left standing to man the walls. When the gates finally creaked open, the French found hollow-eyed wraiths, their bodies so wasted that their armor hung loose like discarded shells. The aftermath revealed the siege's cruel irony. The Duke, expecting to seize a strategic prize, found instead a ruined husk of a castle, its stores empty, its people broken, its value as a military asset erased by the very stubbornness that had prolonged its defense. Yet in that stubbornness lies the siege's true legacy. St. Jean and Calais reminds us that medieval warfare wasn't just about kings and battles. It was about ordinary people pushed to extraordinary extremes, their choices etched not in grand chronicles but in the quiet, terrible calculus of survival. The castle's ruins still stand today, their weathered stones offering no hint of the horrors they once witnessed save for the occasional leather fragment, preserved in the dirt, waiting to tell its story to those who know how to listen. Bergerac stood as the linchpin of French defenses along the Dordogne River, its sturdy walls guarding a vital crossing point between Gascony and central France. When Edward of Woodstock, better known as the Black Prince, rode toward it in August 1345, he wasn't just leading an army, he was testing a bold new strategy. At just 15 years old, this would be his first independent command, a chance to prove that lightning-fast raids could outmaneuver France's slower, more methodical forces. What followed wasn't just a siege, it was a masterclass in the art of shock and awe. The Black Prince's approach defied medieval convention. Instead of lumbering siege engines or months-long blockades, his Anglo-Gascon force struck with terrifying speed. Mounted archers swept the countryside, cutting off reinforcements while the main army descended on Bergerac like a summer storm. The castle's defenders, accustomed to the ritualistic pacing of traditional sieges, found themselves overwhelmed before they could properly fortify the outer defenses. English longbowmen rained arrows so thickly that chroniclers described them as a shadow passing over the sun, while dismounted knights stormed the gates with a ferocity that belied their young leaders' inexperience. Within days, the fortress that had stood unshaken for generations fell into English hands. This victory rippled far beyond Bergerac's walls. The capture secured not just a strategic river crossing but an entire region's loyalty. Gascon nobles who'd wavered between England and France now saw the future a dynamic commander who rewarded boldness with plunder and prestige. The Black Prince distributed spoils with calculated generosity, binding local allies to his cause while his father's diplomats negotiated their formal allegiance. Bergerac became a blueprint. Swift, decisive action could unravel French defenses faster than any grand campaign. Yet the siege's true brilliance lay in what it avoided. By taking Bergerac quickly, the English sidestepped the grueling attrition that doomed so many medieval sieges. No months of starving civilians, no disease-ridden camps, no wasted resources, just a clean, surgical strike that left the castle's infrastructure intact for immediate use. This efficiency became the hallmark of the Black Prince's later campaigns, from Poitiers to the infamous chevauchés that ravaged the French countryside. Walking through Bergerac's quiet streets today, you'd hardly guess this was once the stage for such a pivotal moment. The castle itself is long gone, its stones repurposed into houses and shops. But the lesson remains: in war, speed can be deadlier than strength, and sometimes the greatest victories come not from enduring a siege, but from refusing to play by its rules. Bergerac proved that even the mightiest walls could crumble before the right combination of audacity and timing, a revelation that would echo through the rest of the 100 Years' War. Limoges should have been safe. The city had sworn loyalty to the Black Prince, its gates open to English troops for years. But in the summer of 1370, its betrayal cut deeper than any battlefield wound. When the city's bishop secretly negotiated with the French, handing over Limoges without a fight, Edward of Woodstock, once the golden hero of Crécy and Poitiers, saw only treachery. What followed wasn't just a siege, it was a lesson written in fire and blood. a moment that would stain the Black Prince's legacy forever. The assault began with a thunderclap of mining operations teams of English sappers tunneling beneath Limoges' walls, their work hidden until the very moment the ground shook. On September 19th, the tunnels collapsed, dragging whole sections of the city's fortifications into the earth. Through these gaps poured the prince's men, their rage fueled by months of frustration. The Black Prince, now ravaged by illness and carried into battle on a litter, watched as his soldiers turned the city into a slaughterhouse. Chronicler Jean Froissart, never one to understate, claimed 3,000 civilians perished in the onslaught, a number likely exaggerated, but the horror was undeniable. Streets ran red as the English showed no quarter, cutting down soldiers and townsfolk alike. Even the cathedral offered no refuge. Its doors were battered open, its treasures looted, its sanctity shattered. What makes Limoges so chilling isn't just the violence, it's the cold calculation behind it. This wasn't the heat of battle frenzy of a typical sack. The Black Prince had ordered the destruction methodically, his proclamation clear: no mercy for traitors. In an era where chivalric ideals still held sway, such deliberate brutality toward a surrendered city broke the unwritten rules of war. The siege exposed a darker side of the prince, one hardened by years of chronic illness, financial strain, and the creeping realization that his life's conquests were slipping away. Limoges became his last, desperate act of control, a message to other would-be defectors that betrayal came at an unbearable price. Yet the aftermath revealed the siege's tragic irony. Far from cementing English authority, the massacre turned Limoges into a symbol of French resilience. Survivors rebuilt their shattered homes, their hatred for the English now unshakable. The Black Prince, too ill to continue campaigning, returned to England within the year, his reputation forever shadowed by the carnage he'd ordered. Even his contemporaries struggled to reconcile the hero of Poitiers with the architect of Limoges' suffering. Walking through Limoges today, you'll find scant traces of that terrible September. The rebuilt cathedral stands serene, its stained glass casting colorful light where once there was only smoke and screams. But the lesson lingers. In war, vengeance is a blade that cuts both ways. The Black Prince sought to terrify his enemies into submission. Instead, he gave them a martyr's cause, proving that the heaviest toll of siege warfare wasn't measured in broken walls, but in the hearts of those left to remember. Poitiers Castle didn't just watch history unfold, it shaped it. While the nearby Battle of Poitiers in 1356 stole the spotlight with its capture of French King John II, the fortress itself was the unsung backbone of English control in the region. Perched strategically above the Claine River, its thick walls and towering keep weren't designed for grand showdowns but for the grinding, day-to-day warfare that defined much of the 100 Years' conflict. This was the war beyond the history books, a relentless struggle against roaming mercenary bands, opportunistic raiders, and the slow erosion of supply lines that could cripple an army as surely as any battlefield defeat. What made Poitiers Castle so vital was its role as a stabilizer in chaotic times. Between major campaigns, the countryside teemed with unemployed soldiers, routiers as they were called, who formed armed bands to extort villages and ambush travelers. The castle's garrison became the region's sheriff, its knights patrolling the roads and its archers providing overwatch from the battlements. Chroniclers tell of weekly skirmishes where English defenders sallied forth to break up mercenary camps, only for new bands to emerge like weeds after rain. This wasn't the glorious warfare of chivalric tales. It was a dirty, exhausting battle for control of the very land itself. The Siege of 1356, often overlooked because it coincided with the famous battle, reveals this reality starkly. While the Black Prince lured the French king into a trap near Noailles-Maupertuis, French forces simultaneously laid siege to Poitiers Castle. hoping to reclaim the region's nerve center. But the garrison, hardened by years of irregular warfare, held firm. They'd turned the castle into a hive of defensive innovations, hidden sally ports for surprise attacks, underground cisterns fed by natural springs, and even makeshift firebombs made from wine barrels and pitch. When French sappers tried tunneling under the walls, the English countermined, collapsing their tunnels in clouds of choking dust. Poitiers' endurance had ripple effects far beyond its walls. By tying down French troops during the critical battle, the castle indirectly contributed to the English victory. Its resistance also showcased a brutal truth of medieval logistics. Controlling a region meant holding its strongholds, not just winning field battles. The French could rout mercenaries in the countryside, but without taking Poitiers, their gains were temporary. This lesson wasn't lost on the Black Prince, who later funneled resources into fortifying the castle further, transforming it into a hub for administering conquered territories. Walking through Poitiers' castle ruins today, you won't find the dramatic scars of cannon fire or the grandeur of royal palaces. Instead, you'll see the pragmatic adaptations of a fortress built for endurance. The widened arrow slits covering every approach, the storage cellars dug deep into the bedrock, the worn steps where sentries paced through countless sleepless nights. These quiet details tell the real story of the 100 Years' War, that for every Agincourt or Orléans, there were 100 unnoticed sieges like Poitiers, where the war was won or lost not in heroic charges, but in the stubborn refusal to yield an inch of ground. La Roche-sur-Yon might not appear in many history books, but its story captures the 100 Years' War in miniature, a relentless tug of war where local loyalties mattered as much as royal banners. Nestled in the rolling hills of the Vendée, this modest fortress lacked the grandeur of Chinon or the strategic fame of Calais, yet its stubborn resistance turned it into a microcosm of the wider conflict. While kings plotted grand campaigns in Paris and London, the war here was fought by garrison captains and peasant militias, men who knew every sheep track and apple orchard in the surrounding valleys. Their sieges weren't about glory but survival, a daily grind of patrols, skirmishes, and whispered betrayals that defined life on the war's forgotten front lines. What made La Roche-sur-Yon remarkable was its ability to endure. Unlike coastal castles that relied on naval support or river forts stocked by barges, this inland stronghold depended on its own resourcefulness. The castle's design was pragmatic rather than imposing thick but unadorned walls, a single deep well, and storage cellars carved into the bedrock. When besiegers cut off supply routes, the garrison turned to hidden paths known only to local woodsmen, smuggling in sacks of grain strapped to the backs of sheep under cover of fog. Chroniclers tell of one 6-month blockade where defenders survived on little more than wild mushrooms and rainwater collected in hollowed-out logs, their endurance stretching French patience to the breaking point. The castle's resilience also reveals the war's fractured loyalties. Vendée's peasants had no love for distant Parisian tax collectors, and many secretly aided the English garrison, trading fresh eggs for promises of lower levies. One particularly audacious farmer even disguised himself as a French quartermaster, delivering a wagon of supplies that turned out to be burning pitch, a makeshift incendiary that sent besiegers scrambling. These small-scale acts of defiance underscore a harsh truth. For rural communities, the war wasn't about crowns or treaties, but which overlord would leave them enough harvest to survive the winter. Yet La Roche-sur-Yon's fate was ultimately decided by larger tides. In 1420, after years of seesaw battles, a French army arrived with something the local garrison couldn't outwit or outlast: gunpowder. The castle's walls, designed to repel trebuchets and scaling ladders, crumbled under sustained cannon fire. Even then, surrender came not with a dramatic last stand but a weary negotiation, the English captain trading the keys for safe passage home. The French, eager to secure the region's loyalty, rebuilt the fortress but left its scars visible, a silent warning against future resistance. Today, standing in La Roche-sur-Yon's shadow, you won't find grand monuments or tourist crowds. The castle's worn stones blend into the landscape, their roughness a testament to the war's unvarnished reality. But look closer, and you'll see the grooves where ropes once lowered baskets to secret allies below, the patched sections of wall where cannonballs struck home. This fortress reminds us that history isn't just made on famous battlefields, but in the quiet stubbornness of ordinary places, where the weight of a century's conflict was carried not by kings, but by sheep drivers whispering in the dark and hungry soldiers counting raindrops in a barrel. St. Malo wasn't just a castle, it was a pirate kingdom carved in stone, a lawless frontier where the line between patriot and outlaw blurred with the tide. Perched on a rocky islet off Brittany's coast, its walls rose straight from the sea, as if daring the English to attack across the waves. But what made St. Malo truly formidable wasn't its battlements alone, it was the ruthless captains who called it home. These weren't ordinary defenders, they were corsairs, licensed by the French crown to raid English shipping under the elegant euphemism of privateering. For them, the 100 Years' War wasn't just a conflict of nations, it was a golden opportunity for plunder. The castle's design reflected its dual life as fortress and pirate den. Thick sea walls bristled with cannon emplacements, their arcs of fire calculated to cover incoming and outgoing ships. Hidden coves beneath the ramparts allowed raiders to slip out under cover of fog or darkness, while the labyrinthine streets inside the walls teemed with taverns where crews divided their loot. St. Malo's most infamous son, the privateer Robert Surcouf, wouldn't be born until centuries later, but the tradition of maritime ruthlessness began here during the war's bitterest phases. English merchants learned to dread the sight of Malouin sails on the horizon, their ships stripped of cargo, their crews held for ransom or worse. When the English finally laid siege in 1492, technically after the war's end, but part of its lingering hostilities, they faced a challenge unlike any other. Traditional siege tactics were useless against a fortress that could be resupplied by sea under the noses of blockading ships. The Malouins had spent decades perfecting the art of evasion, using their knowledge of the treacherous local currents to outmaneuver larger vessels. Attempts to bombard the walls from ships founded on hidden reefs, while landing parties were repelled by a militia of fishermen turned fighters, their nets and harpoons as deadly as any knight's sword. The siege's ultimate failure revealed a paradigm shift in warfare. St. Malo proved that coastal castles could defy land armies indefinitely if they controlled the waterways, a lesson that shaped naval strategy for centuries. But its deeper legacy lies in the anarchic spirit it embodied. This wasn't a garrison following orders from distant kings. It was a community of opportunists who waged their own war, one captured barrel of wine at a time. Walking St. Malo's ramparts today, you can almost hear the echoes of tavern songs and clinking gold, a reminder that some battles weren't fought for crowns or glory, but for the sheer, unapologetic thrill of the hunt. Dinan's siege in 1357 was no ordinary clash of armies. It was a stage where the fading ideals of chivalry took one final, dramatic bow. Unlike the brutal starvation tactics of Rouen or the gunpowder thunder at Cherbourg, this Breton stronghold witnessed something almost quaint by medieval standards, a duel fought not for victory alone, but for honor. The castle's fate hinged on the outcome of a single combat between two men, Bertrand du Guesclin, a rising star in French resistance, and an English knight named Thomas of Canterbury. Their battle atop the ramparts, watched by both armies, became the stuff of legend, a moment where personal valor briefly overshadowed the war's grinding pragmatism. What made Dinan extraordinary wasn't just the duel itself, but the context surrounding it. The town had endured months of blockade, its people caught between French loyalists and English occupiers. Du Guesclin, then a young commander known for his unkempt appearance and tactical brilliance, had been leading guerrilla raids against the English garrison. When Thomas challenged him to single combat, a throwback to the romances of King Arthur, it was more than personal pride at stake. Accepting meant risking his life to potentially spare Dinan further suffering. Refusing would undermine his reputation as a leader. The clash that followed, with poleaxes ringing against shields and both men bleeding onto the stones, ended with Du Guesclin's victory. But what happened next was even more surprising. Instead of slaughtering the defeated garrison, the French negotiated terms so lenient they shocked contemporaries. English soldiers were allowed to march out with their weapons and banners, their lives spared in exchange for abandoning the castle. This rare display of mercy reveals how deeply chivalric ideals still permeated medieval warfare, even as the 100 Years' War grew increasingly brutal. Chroniclers of the time latched onto the story, portraying Du Guesclin as the perfect knight, a man who could wield both sword and diplomacy with equal skill. Yet Dinan's chivalric facade couldn't mask the war's harsher realities. The duel's aftermath saw Du Guesclin's star rise, but the castle itself changed hands repeatedly in later years, its genteel surrender forgotten in the scramble for territory. The siege's true legacy lies in its paradox, a fleeting moment where honor mattered more than land, where two men's courage briefly overruled the calculus of conquest. Walking Dinan's ramparts today, you can still see the stretch where the duel likely occurred, the stones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. It's a poignant reminder that war is more than strategies and sieges. Sometimes it's about the stories we choose to tell, the myths we cling to long after the fighting ends. Falaise Castle stood as a living bridge between two eras of conquest, the birthplace of William the Conqueror, whose descendants now fought to hold the very lands he'd seized centuries earlier. When French forces surrounded it in 1450, they weren't just attacking a strategic stronghold, they were dismantling the last physical symbol of English legitimacy in Normandy. The castle's weathered stones had witnessed the rise of the Norman dynasty, its great hall echoing with the childhood footsteps of the man who would change England forever. Now those same walls trembled under cannon fire, their collapse marking not just a military defeat but the end of an epoch. The siege of Falaise was less a battle than a reckoning. By the time French King Charles VII arrived with his army, the tide of war had turned irreversibly. English garrisons across Normandy had already fallen like dominoes, their supply lines severed and morale crumbling. Yet Falaise's defenders, a mix of battle-hardened veterans and local conscripts, clung to the hope that their castle's legendary reputation might give pause. They underestimated Charles's resolve. His cannons, positioned on the high ground William once played upon as a boy, pounded the castle's once proud keep with methodical precision. Each impact sent plumes of dust into the air, the very fabric of history disintegrating under the relentless barrage. What makes Falaise's fall so poignant is how it mirrors the broader arc of the war. Just as the conflict began with dynastic claims rooted in Norman conquest, its conclusion unfolded at the cradle of that legacy. The castle's design, a blend of William's original 12th century fortifications and later medieval upgrades, became its own undoing. Thick walls built to repel arrows and trebuchets splintered under Gunpowder's force, a stark reminder that warfare had evolved while England's ambitions remained tethered to the past. When the gates finally burst open in July 1450, the French found not just a defeated garrison but a relic, a place frozen in time, its storied past no match for the present's brutal realities. Yet the siege's aftermath reveals a curious twist. Charles, perhaps sensing the weight of history, chose not to raise Falaise as he had other English-held castles. Instead, he preserved its shell, a tacit acknowledgement of its significance even in defeat. Walking its corridors today, you can trace the layers of this paradox. The Norman arches where William's father once held court, now framing exhibits about the siege that undid his descendants' dreams. Falaise's true lesson isn't just about the futility of clinging to old glories. It's about how conquests, no matter how grand, are always provisional. The castle endures not as a trophy of victory or a monument to defeat, but as a silent witness to the truth that no empire, no matter how fiercely defended, outlasts the tides of change. Avranches wasn't just another fortress, it was the linchpin holding together the fractured borderlands of Brittany and Normandy. Perched on a rocky outcrop overlooking the bay of Mont-Saint-Michel, its position gave commanders something far more valuable than high walls: control over the entire region's pulse. Every supply convoy moving between these contested territories, every messenger carrying orders, every band of reinforcements, all funneled through the narrow passes beneath Avranches' watchtowers. When English forces laid siege in 1418, they weren't just attacking a castle, they were trying to sever the French kingdom's lifeline to its last loyal Breton allies. The geography here made Avranches uniquely brutal to besiege. Unlike flatland castles where armies could surround defenses evenly, the terrain forced attackers into confined approaches where defenders could concentrate their fire. Steep coastal cliffs meant no naval blockade could fully cut off supplies. Small boats could always slip through under cover of darkness, bringing barrels of salted fish or bundles of crossbow bolts. But the real challenge lay in the castle's relationship with the tides. Like its more famous neighbor Mont-Saint-Michel, Avranches' access routes transformed twice daily as the sea advanced or retreated, turning the surrounding marshes into either impassable quagmires or vulnerable pathways. A commander who mistimed his assault might find his troops waist-deep in rising water, their siege ladders floating away like driftwood. What makes Avranches' sieges so revealing is how they expose the war's logistical chess game. When the French recaptured it in 1424 after a grueling 6-month blockade, they didn't just gain a stronghold, they unlocked the ability to threaten English holdings across northern Brittany. Suddenly, garrisons in Saint-Malo and Dinan found their supply lines compromised, forcing them to choose between starvation or humiliating retreat. The castle became a revolving door of occupation, changing hands 5 times between 1415 and 1450, each shift sending ripples through the regional balance of power. Chroniclers noted how control of Avranches' granaries often mattered more than its armory. The side holding it could feed their armies while starving opponents into submission. The castle's final siege in 1449 encapsulates medieval warfare's evolving nature. French forces, now equipped with state-of-the-art bombards, reduced its famed curtain walls to rubble in weeks rather than months. Yet even in ruin, Avranches retained strategic value. Its shattered towers were rebuilt with thicker bases to withstand cannon fire, a physical manifestation of how the 100 Years' War had rewritten the rules of fortification. Walking its cliffside ramparts today, you can still see the distinct masonry layers, the older, elegant Norman arches giving way to the squat, pragmatic Gunpowder era rebuilds. These stones tell a silent story of adaptation, reminding us that in war, geography may dictate strategy, but survival belongs to those who learn to change with the times. Mortagne Castle never saw the grand battles of Agincourt or the dramatic standoffs of Orléans, but its story lingers in the quiet corners of history, a reminder that wars aren't won by glory alone. Tucked away in the rolling hills of western France, this unassuming fortress became the linchpin of a shadow war, its garrison holding the line while flashier sieges stole the spotlight. While kings and chroniclers obsessed over the clash of crowns, Mortagne's defenders waged a different kind of fight, a grinding, thankless struggle against hunger, isolation, and the creeping dread of being forgotten. What made Mortagne extraordinary wasn't its architecture. Its walls were sturdy but unremarkable, but its stubborn refusal to collapse. Perched at the crossroads of three contested provinces, the castle became a silent guardian of supply routes, its garrison intercepting enemy patrols and sheltering French partisans. Unlike the dramatic sieges of coastal castles, Mortagne's battles were fought in whispers and shadows. Its captain, a grizzled veteran named Thibault de Chauvigny, mastered the art of the invisible war. His men slipped through forests to ambush English convoys, then vanished before reinforcements arrived. They repaired breaches in the dead of night, using mud and straw to camouflage damaged masonry by dawn. While other garrisons starved under blockade, Mortagne's soldiers foraged so effectively that local law claimed they could live on acorns and resolve. The siege of 1421 should have been Mortagne's end. 1,000 English troops surrounded its walls, their cannons battering the gatehouse day and night. Inside, de Chauvigny had just 80 men and a secret. Months earlier, he'd ordered the excavation of a hidden tunnel snaking beyond the siege lines to a nearby sheepfold. Through this earthy lifeline, shepherds smuggled in cheese and grain, while children carried out messages tied to their belts. The English, convinced the castle's endurance was supernatural, never discovered the trick. After 6 weeks of futile bombardment, they marched away, leaving Mortagne standing as if by some quiet miracle. Yet history has no ballads for Thibault de Chauvigny. No chronicles detail his tactics, no tapestries immortalize his defiance. Mortagne's resilience exists only in scattered payroll records and a single faded letter praising its most diligent and unnoticed service. This obscurity speaks volumes about how we remember war. For every Joan of Arc, there were 100 Thibault's men and women who fought without fanfare. Their victories measured not in captured banners but in roads kept open, villages spared, and small, essential acts of refusal. Walking Mortagne's ruins today, you won't find plaques or tour guides. The tunnel has collapsed, the sheepfold long gone. But the lesson remains. Sometimes the strongest walls aren't made of stone, but of the stubborn will to endure when no one is watching. Verneuil wasn't just another battlefield. It was a slaughterhouse where the echoes of Agincourt rang with terrifying familiarity. In August 1424, beneath the shadow of its towering castle, an Anglo-French clash unfolded so brutal that chroniclers would later call it the Second Agincourt. But while the famous Battle of 1415 became a legend of English longbows and muddy triumph, Verneuil's story is darker, a tale of resilience twisted by desperation and a castle that became the last refuge for men who'd already stared hell in the face. The siege of Verneuil's castle was the grim aftermath of that bloody field. After hours of carnage, the shattered remnants of the French and Scottish armies, now more a mob than a fighting force, retreated toward the fortress, dragging wounded comrades through the summer heat. The English, led by the Duke of Bedford, didn't just want victory, they sought annihilation. As the castle gates creaked shut behind the survivors, the real test began. Inside, the garrison faced a nightmare. Walls designed to repel medieval arrows now trembled under the relentless pounding of early gunpowder weapons. The castle's well, once a reliable source of water, ran dangerously low as the English poisoned nearby streams, and then came the bodies. Here's where Verneuil's story chills the blood. With no time to bury the thousands slain in the battle, the English began catapulting decomposing corpses over the walls, a medieval form of biological warfare. The stench alone was weaponized, choking defenders and spreading disease. Yet somehow the garrison held. For weeks they endured the unimaginable, fighting off assaults while stepping over the dead, rationing moldy bread, and sleeping in shifts amid the flies and the groans of the dying. Their resilience wasn't born of patriotism alone, but of sheer survival instinct. They knew surrender meant execution. Bedford, determined to make an example, had ordered no quarter given. What makes Verneuil's endurance so remarkable is how it defied the era's conventions. Most castles fell quickly after a major field defeat, their defenders demoralized. But Verneuil's garrison, a mix of Scottish mercenaries and local French knights, fought with the frenzied energy of men who had nothing left to lose. They repelled mining attempts by lowering flaming barrels into the tunnels, their laughter reportedly audible over the screams of buried sappers. When English siege towers rolled forward, the defenders unleashed a hidden stockpile of Greek fire, a napalm-like substance that clung to flesh and couldn't be extinguished with water. These weren't the chivalric duels of storybooks. This was total war, fought with every cruel ingenuity the Middle Ages could muster. The castle's final moments were as dramatic as its defense. With the outer walls breached and fires raging unchecked, the survivors staged a midnight breakout, carving through English lines in a desperate dash for freedom. Few made it. Those captured were hanged from the very ramparts they defended, their bodies left to sway as a warning. Yet in death, they achieved what living couldn't. Verneuil's resistance drained Bedford's resources so thoroughly that his planned march on Paris stalled, buying critical time for French regroupment. Walking Verneuil's ruins today, you won't find plaques celebrating its stand. The battle overshadowed the siege, and the castle itself was largely dismantled centuries later. But the lesson lingers in the uneven ground where its foundations once stood, that even in defeat, resilience reshapes destiny. Verneuil proved that castles weren't just strongholds, they could be acts of defiance, their stones absorbing enough blood and time to tip the scales of history. Alençon Castle stood as more than just stone and mortar. It was the stage for one of the 100 Years' War's most heartbreaking dramas, where loyalty to crown collided with bonds of blood. The fortress itself was impressive, its square towers looming over the Sarthe River, but its true story lies in the rift between two brothers, Count Jean of Alençon, a fierce French loyalist, and his younger sibling Pierre, who swore allegiance to the English crown. Their bitter feud turned this Norman stronghold into a battleground of conflicting oaths, proving that in war, the deepest wounds often come from those who share your name. When French forces laid siege to Alençon in 1424, the defenders weren't just facing an external enemy, they were grappling with the agony of divided kin. Pierre, commanding the garrison, had made his choice years earlier, lured by English promises of land and titles. Jean, meanwhile, had become one of France's most relentless commanders, his reputation sealed at the Battle of Verneuil. Now, as Jean's troops encircled his childhood home, the siege became a grim family reunion. Chroniclers tell of shouted pleas between the walls, Jean demanding his brother's surrender while Pierre hurled accusations of betrayal. The castle's thick curtains couldn't muffle the sound of siblings cursing each other in the same dialect. What makes Alençon's story so compelling isn't just the familial tragedy, it's how it mirrors the war's broader fractures. Noble families across France and England found themselves split by the conflict, cousins facing cousins across battle lines, their choices dictated as much by landholdings as by patriotism. The Count of Alençon's dilemma was especially cruel. To take the castle meant destroying his brother's future, yet to spare it endangered France's fragile resurgence. When his cannon finally breached the gates after 6 brutal weeks, the victory felt hollow. Pierre escaped under cover of night, leaving behind a ruin both of stone and of kinship. The aftermath reveals war's uncanny ability to twist even victory into sorrow. Jean reclaimed Alençon for France, but at the cost of his family's unity. Years later, when Pierre was captured at the Battle of Patay, it was Jean who interceded to spare his life, a fleeting moment of reconciliation in a lifetime of estrangement. The castle itself, rebuilt and reforged, stands today as a silent witness to these layered loyalties. Visitors walking its ramparts might admire the medieval architecture, but the real history lingers in the whispers between the stones of brothers who chose different flags, of a war that could divide blood but never quite erase its pull. Alençon reminds us that the 100 Years' War wasn't just fought on fields or at sea, but in the quiet, shattered spaces between those who once called each other family. Querton wasn't just another castle, it was the last stubborn gasp of English dreams in France, a final flicker of defiance before the flame went out. By the time French forces surrounded it in 1450, the 100 Years' War had become a ghost of itself, a conflict outliving its own purpose. The English garrison holed up inside those walls knew the truth. They weren't fighting for victory anymore, but for time. Every day they held Querton was another day the war's inevitable end could be postponed, another sunrise before the reckoning. What made this siege different wasn't tactics or technology, it was the crushing weight of history. The castle's thick Norman walls, built centuries earlier to repel Viking raiders, now faced French cannons forged in the same foundries that had toppled Cherbourg and Rouen. Inside, the defenders were a patchwork of grizzled veterans and fresh-faced recruits, their uniforms frayed, their supplies dwindling, yet they fought with a ferocity that surprised even their commanders. These men had nothing left to lose. Many were the sons and grandsons of soldiers who'd crossed the Channel decades earlier, men who'd never known a world where Calais wasn't English soil. To surrender Querton wasn't just admitting defeat, it meant abandoning the only home they'd ever known. The French assault was methodical, a stark contrast to the chaos of earlier sieges. King Charles VII's generals had learned from decades of war. Instead of wasteful frontal assaults, they tightened the noose slowly, cutting off supply routes and bombarding the castle's weakest points with precision. But even as Querton's towers crumbled, the garrison pulled off one last act of defiance. Under cover of a moonless night, they launched a desperate sortie, not to break the siege, but to destroy their own armory, denying the French the satisfaction of capturing their weapons. Chronicles describe the explosion lighting up the countryside, a final thunderclap echoing across the marshes. When the gates finally fell in July 1450, the surrender was eerily quiet. There were no massacres, no vengeful reprisals. The war had bled both sides dry of even the capacity for cruelty. French soldiers watched in silence as the last English troops marched out, their banners caked in dust, their heads oddly unbowed. In that moment, Querton became more than a castle. It was a funeral pyre for an empire that had stretched from Bordeaux to Paris, now reduced to a single crumbling stronghold, and the memories of those who'd held it. Walking Querton's ruins today, you won't find the grandeur of Chinon or the dramatic scars of cannon fire like at Cherbourg. The stones here whisper a different story, one of stubbornness in the face of inevitability, of men who knew the tide had turned but refused to stop swimming against it. The castle's fall didn't just mark the end of English ambitions in France. It closed a chapter where kings could claim continents through parchment lineages and sword strokes. Caernton's true legacy isn't in its resistance, but in its silence afterward, the quiet recognition that some wars end not with treaties, but with the last gate creaking shut and a key changing hands for the final time. The echoes of these sieges linger not just in crumbling stone, but in the very fabric of how we understand conflict and resilience. Each castle we've explored, from the doomed grandeur of Château Gaillard to the pirate stronghold of Saint-Malo, tells a story far beyond arrows and battering rams. They reveal the raw calculus of survival, the burghers of Calais weighing their lives against their city's freedom, the starving defenders of Saint-Gilles and gaily boiling leather for broth, the brothers at Alençon torn between blood and banners. These weren't just battles, they were turning points where individual choices rippled across centuries. Consider how these sieges reshaped the medieval world. The fall of Cherbourg proved no wall could withstand gunpowder's roar, while Mont-Saint-Michel's defiance showed how geography and belief could outlast armies. Rouen's tragedy exposed war's darkest truth, that civilians always pay the steepest price, and Joan of Arc's triumph at Orléans reminded us how conviction can tip the scales of history. Even lesser-known strongholds like Mortagne, with its secret tunnels and unsung heroes, played their part in the war's slow grind. Together, they sketch a portrait of an era where castles weren't just fortresses but fulcrums of power, their stones absorbing the hopes and horrors of everyone from kings to cobblers. What makes these ruins worth remembering isn't their military significance alone, but the human shadows they cast. When you walk the ramparts of Caernton or gaze up at Chinon's towers, you're not just seeing medieval engineering, you're standing where ordinary people faced impossible choices. The baker's daughter who hauled buckets of boiling oil to the battlements, the scribe who kept tally of dwindling grain sacks, the mercenary who switched sides for a warmer cloak. Their voices may be lost to time, but their legacy lives on in the lessons these sieges teach us about endurance, adaptation, and the cost of ambition. The 100 Years' War didn't just end with a treaty. It faded like smoke from a spent cannon, leaving behind a Europe forever changed. The castles that survived became blueprints for a new age, their designs evolving from arrow loops to gun ports, their lords swapping feudal oaths for standing armies. Yet their greatest gift might be the perspective they offer, a chance to measure our own struggles against theirs. When modern life feels overwhelming, think of the citizens of Harfleur rebuilding their shattered homes, or the garrison at Verneuil holding fast amidst unimaginable horror. If they could endure, perhaps so can we. As the sun sets on our journey through these 25 sieges, I'd love to hear which story stayed with you. Was it the heartbreak of Limoges, the ingenuity of Bergerac's lightning strike, or the quiet defiance of La Roche-sur-Yon? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. History is always richer when shared. And if you've enjoyed unraveling these tales, don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. Until next time, remember, every castle has 1,000 stories hidden in its mortar. You just have to know how